Hello, math people. All right, back to it. Yesterday we did multiplying and dividing negative numbers in a PEMDAS situation. I guess we also had adding and subtracting in there too. Order of operations, right? We were simplifying expressions. Today we are going to be solving equations. Now, we did solving equations earlier in the unit with addition and subtraction. Today we're going to focus on solving one-step equations that involve either multiplication or division. So the only thing I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through 4 example problems, and these are just refreshers of things that we have done earlier in the year. This is not very new. The only new addition is the fact that we're going to have negative numbers involved. So our first example I'm going to write out, and I wrote at the top here, remember, we solve equations using inverse operations. So our first example is going to be x divided by 3 is equal to -6. All right, so what is the inverse of divide by 3? Well, its inverse is to multiply. So we're going to multiply both sides of the equation by 3. When you multiply by 3 on this side, inverse operations undo each other. So it cancels out the divide by 3, and we're left with x on the left side of the equation. And to keep things balanced, whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. So we're going to multiply by 3. And my final answer here should be -18. Because -6 times 3, 6 times 3 is 18. And since there's one negative, the whole answer is negative. And remember, you can always check, right? X divided by 3. So -18 divided by 3 is equal to -6. So I know that this thing checks out. Always double check, make sure A, your answer makes sense, and B, double check the positive and negative, because that's the big part of the lesson. On to our next example. Our next example here, we're going to have 18 is equal to -4 y. That would be 4 times y. So your question is, what's the opposite or the inverse of multiply? Because that's the operation that's happening here. And the inverse of times -4 is to divide by -4. And when you do inverse operations, that cancels things out, and we're left with y equals, and whatever you do to one side of the equation to keep it balanced, you do to the other side. I feel like I'm on repeat. So the problem here is 18 divided by -4, which if you do that division, you should end up with -4.5. 18 divided by 4 is 4.5, and it's negative because in the division problem, there's only one negative and one positive. All right. Hopefully this is ringing a bell and feeling familiar. We're going to do 2 more examples. In this next example, I'm going to throw some fractions into the mix because why not? Let's go with -4/5 x is equal to -8. So right here, 4/5 x, that's 4/5 times x. So I know the inverse is going to be division. So technically, you're going to be dividing by 4/5, dividing by 4/5. But if you are remembering correctly, when you divide by fractions, dividing by fractions is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So instead of writing divide by 4/5 and then having to rewrite it as times 5/4, because the reciprocal is when you flip the fraction, you could just, instead of that, multiply both sides by -5/4. And if you do that over here, the fractions reduce down to 1. Effectively, they cancel out, and it leaves x on this side. And whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. So let's multiply by -5/4 over here. And when we multiply by fractions, let's put this thing over 1. Whole numbers are always over 1. And now I'm just going to be multiplying numerator times numerator and denominator times denominator. So first thing I'm going to actually point out is I'm multiplying a negative by a negative. So my answer, final answer here, is going to be some positive number. So Let's just ignore the negatives altogether. 8 times 5 is 40. 1 times 4 is 4. And 40 over 4, if you reduce that to simplest form, is the same thing as 10. So my final answer is x equals positive 10. Positive because I did a negative times a negative, which should result in a positive. All right. And I hope you're remembering what I mean by reciprocal. Reciprocal is you flip the fraction. So instead of dividing here, you might as well just multiply by the reciprocal, since ultimately that's what you'll be doing anyways. Let's do one more example. Example 4. Again, let's throw in fractions. Let's do negative 6 is equal to 3 halves times z. All right, so since it's 3 over 2 times z, I'm going to be dividing by 3 over 2. But that's the same thing we just said as multiplying by the reciprocal, so let's multiply by 2/3. That's going to cancel out all of the fractions here, and I'm going to be left with z equals, and whatever we do to one side, we do to the other. So I'm going to multiply by 2/3. Put this whole number over 1. It's a negative times a positive, so I know my final answer is going to be negative something. And 6 times 2 is 12, and 3 times 1 is 3. So I've got negative 12/3, which is the same thing as negative 4 if we reduced the fraction to simplest form. So final answer, best possible answer, is z is equal to negative 4. If you want, plug that back in to the original problem and double check. If z equals negative 4, 3 times negative 4 is 12 over 2, which is negative 6. So it definitely checks out. Your work today is going to involve, 10 or so, I think, problems. There are also a couple problems that ask you to translate. So read a word problem and turn that word problem into an equation. And then some of the problems say, take it a step further, solve the equation. So a couple pointers. Number one, there's an example in the written out notes where the practice problems are of a word problem. I would advise you to read through that if you're not feeling super strong with the translating part. My advice is read the problem, write out what is happening in words, like use words to write out the scenario, and then take your words and replace the words with numbers if they're in the problem, or if they're not in the problem, then that's going to be your variable, your unknown. So you'll use x or t or whatever variable you want to use. Also, make sure your answer makes sense in the context of the problem. If you solve something, go back and read the question. In the notes, the problem is asking about when will the temperature be x, y, or z. Make sure that your answer seems reasonable. If it doesn't seem reasonable in the context of what the problem is even asking, go back. Something might have gone wrong. So for example, if it's asking for time, you shouldn't be getting a negative number because there's no such thing as negative time. Always make sure your answer makes sense. With that being said, it's time for you to do some practice, so good luck. Take your time, write out your steps, show your work, ask us questions, join Google Meets, do all the things that you do, and have fun doing math. Goodbye.